I have not seen the catalog yet. I am guessing as to what might or might not be in it, but this will provide you with a good introduction to her work, which is not as famous as that of her friends and colleagues Ansel Adams or Edward Weston, but which I think you will find intriguingly rich and varied and wide-ranging. Cunningham was born in Portland but raised in Seattle. And in 1903, she entered the University of Washington, but she was already a photographer. At the age of 18 in 1901, she had sent away for a camera, as one did at that time, and a correspondence course on photography. So when she went to the University of Washington in 1903, there was no program in photography, so she would major in chemistry. And when she got her first more professional camera in 1906, this is one of the earliest images she made with it. So it's 1906. Here is a young woman who does not yet have the right to vote, but she strips herself naked, lies down in a field, and makes this self-portrait as reclining nude, evoking one of the most important genres of Western painting, going back to Giorgione and Titian at the beginning of the 16th century, but doing it with her own body. There is a real sense of daring there. Now, we know that she admired the work of Gertrude Kezebir, and both in this self-portrait and in Kezebir's work like The Manger, which she would have seen in the very first edition of Alfred Stieglitz's journal Camera Work, which was devoted to the work of Kezebir in 1903, and which she would have seen again in Gustav Stickley's The Craftsman in 1906, where this image was reproduced. Cunningham is finding in Kezebir a role model, someone who writes about how fitting the profession of photography is for a woman, and who makes images that Cunningham finds very moving, especially the images of mothers and infants. But this goes well beyond simply a portrait of a mother with a newborn by titling this work The Manger, by setting it, as it were, in a stable and providing a veil for the female figure. Kezebir makes this not just a portrait, but a nativity scene. Again, like Cunningham with her reclining nude, taking up one of the major themes of Western painting. And in fact, that is a hugely important gambit within the style of turn-of-the-century photography known as pictorialism. Pictorialist photographers, Alfred Stieglitz among them, Gertrude Kezebir as well, sought to make of photography not simply a photomechanical process for reproduction, but a fine art. And to do so, they drew on the art of painting, and they used certain techniques like soft focus to make their painting or their photography look more like Impressionist painting or Old Master painting. So this style was extremely important around the early 20th century and was attempting to establish the legitimacy of photography as a fine art. Well, Cunningham graduated with that chemistry degree in 1907 and went to work in the Seattle portrait studio of Edward Curtis. Curtis is best known for his magisterial project, The North American Indian, a multi-volume compendium of photographs of the native tribes, for which he traveled for months out of every year, took images of Native Americans in their regalia, in their own habitat, but it took a lot of money to support that undertaking, and Curtis's bread and butter was his portrait studio. So Cunningham was manning the studio in his absence. There she would have perfected her ability to make platinum prints, which was the demanding process at the time until platinum became prohibitively expensive during the Great War and was replaced by silver. But platinum printing is a trickier, fiddly process. She would have learned darkroom techniques like spotting to get a pristine print. And she would have learned portrait photography, the art of getting the best of one's sitter, because like Curtis, she would make her living in her long career primarily as a portrait photographer. In 1909, she won a scholarship from her sorority at the UW to study abroad, to study photography in Germany, which was then in the vanguard, both for the chemical processes of developing printing, but also for photography considered as art. Alfred Stieglitz had also studied in Germany. And in Dresden, her professor asked her to photograph him. And she said the most important thing she learned from him was in the process of making his portrait, he said, "I'm going to do a mathematical calculation in my head. And when it appears that I have reached the moment of maximum intensity of thought, that is when you snap the shutter." And so she would use that advice throughout her career. She came home to Seattle in 1910 and set up her own portrait studio. She did have a location, but she preferred to take her camera and a dozen glass plate negatives to the homes of her sitters to photograph them in their own environment. And here she is capturing a woman named Claire, and this photograph has a lot of the strategies of pictorialist photography, that soft focus, that sense of an aura around the figure, but those are also very appropriate to this woman's profession. She was a medium, someone who consorted with spirits and communicated with the other side. And Cunningham is able to suggest that through her use of natural light, through the way that she sets the camera to achieve this slightly soft and fuzzy image. In Veiled Woman, which she makes of a friend of hers, she is again drawing on the art historical tradition. There are a number of sculptures, Baroque ones in particular, where a sculptor captures a woman wearing a veil and the way that the veil clings to the flesh. Cunningham does that with photography, but making this very mysterious, enigmatic image. She was influenced by the pre-Raphaelites, by poetry, by the Um, uh, the novels of William Morris, his utopian Sylvan novels. And her friends had an art gallery where she found herself working, or perhaps more volunteering, but one of her jobs was to send a check to Roy Partridge, another of their number who was living and working in Paris, anytime he sold an etching through their gallery. Well, Partridge came to anticipate with great pleasure not just the checks, but the letters that Cunningham would send him. They began to correspond even when there was no money to cross the Atlantic. And when he had to return home in 1914, as World War I was breaking out, they finally met in person. And they fell in love and were married in January of 2015. So in this early portrait of Partridge, it still has something of that soft focus of pictorialist photography, but she poses him against one of his own ambitious large-scale etchings, and we get an early example of her interest in photographing other artists. She would also, in that first year of their marriage, make some photographs of Roy frolicking on Mount Rainier, Roy in the buff. It was unusual enough for a female photographer to make a female nude. It was almost unheard of for one to make a male nude. But Cunningham did not just create this body of work. She published some of the photographs in a Seattle art journal. And one critic lambasted her as a fallen woman, saying that she had to be a person of loose morals to disseminate such foul images of her husband in this sylvan landscape, as if he is a mythological god or satyr out there in the Cascades. Well, they married in January. In December, Cunningham had her first baby, Griffith. And then in 1917, she had her second and third babies, twins, Padraig and Rondal. So by 1917, she has 3 children under 2. She closes her portrait studio and begins to focus her photographic efforts on her new family, making exactly the same kind of images that her idol Gertrude Kesebier had made with the manger, except that she is the mother and her own offspring, the child, as we see in the self-portrait at left, or with the twins evoking the ancient Roman figure of Charity, who is often seen nursing twins. The twins and Griffith would be among her most important photographic subjects for the next decade or so. Here, the twins on the grass, they are about 5 and densely freckled, but these boys are into everything. They were such a handful. So she depicts them in the grass twining right over them, as if they are themselves the kind of nature spirits she had made Roy into. But look at this hand. That boy has been making mud pies or something. His hands are filthy, and they, it was difficult to get them to slow down enough to pose even in natural light. The following year, she made this beautiful image that she printed in platinum of her father and her twin sons. So this is an image that is 3 generations of her family, except that the third, the center one, is implied. It is on the other side of the lens, the photographer. And her sons are, both very alike and yet subtly different. Her father with his long beard in the center. And her father was a person that she adored and was deeply proud of. He had been born in Virginia, and at the age of 12 or 13, he crossed into the North to fight for the Union Army. So he was someone who had been on the right side of history during her childhood. They had spent some time in a commune out on the peninsula, utterly self-sufficient, chopping wood, growing their own food, and he remained that self-sufficient into his 90s. So in 36, she made this image of my father at 90, in which he is sitting in front of the wood pile he had chopped himself. So we see his mallet and the wedge that he used to split all that wood. And yes, he looks ancient like Methuselah, and he uses a cane, but his back is straight, and he is just as proud as his abilities as his daughter was. He was also a free thinker, someone who encouraged her early efforts, and in fact built her first darkroom in the family woodshed. In the early 20s, Cunningham is now living in Oakland as Roy got a job at Mills College, and he and she are in touch with other California artists, including perhaps the most important relationship she has with a photographer in these years is with Edward Weston, who was at this period living in the Los Angeles area with fellow photographer Margaretta Mather. So in 1922, Imogen and Roy visited Weston and Mather, and she made this wonderfully sensual image of the pair that does have some of that aspect of pictorialist photography, that rather dated style of the early 20th century, but it also looks extremely modern. Like this could be a perfume ad in Vogue today. And the following year, she made this image of Mather's torso. But it is not just Mather. It is again Mather and Weston. Making this work extra sensual is the fact that one nude torso is melding into a second. So we see Weston's arm framing the side of Mather's body. We see their necks side by side, their collarbones, and so forth. So Cunningham continues to work in this very sensual medium of the nude. But in the early 1920s, she's working primarily in her own backyard. And that meant she was doing a lot of botanical photography. And both she and Weston are transitioning from that lush, soft-focused pictorialist style to what they called straight photography, using the camera for what it does best, getting a sharply focused image that can provide us with more information than the human eye can take in. So here she's photographing a magnolia blossom. This is one of her most famous images. And she has found a perfect bloom, not a bit of brown on the edges, no bruising, and she lights it as if it is itself luminous, lit from within. But around the same time, she gets even closer. In Tower of Jewels, as she calls this work, which if we hadn't just looked at this image, we might struggle to understand what we were looking at. This looks like abstract sculpture with those perfect spiral forms coming off the top of the center of the magnolia blossom. It's a very striking image. So she's doing a lot of botanical work in the 1920s, some of which is frankly phallic, like her exploding bud, Bilbergia here, and some of which is self-consciously abstract. So rather than trying to look like old master painting, some straight photographers were emulating instead modern abstract painting. So this she calls leaf pattern. And we get these strong darks and lights, these serrated edges of that leaf, these shadows in the background. It is similar in a way to what New York artists like Paul Strand were doing in their botanical images from the late 1920s, like Strand's Wild Iris Maine. But I believe that Cunningham goes farther than Strand does in the direction of abstraction in works like Leaf Pattern. Another of her most famous images is Two Callas. And Cunningham would say that there is a lot of interest in doubling in her work because of her experience of birthing twins. So we get multiple times within Cunningham's work the same but different, two of a kind with subtle differences. Here, one calla primarily in the darkness, the other more brightly lit, a bit like she posed her two twins with her father. And calla lilies were, of course, a signature image of Art Deco and were beginning to be used by Georgia O'Keeffe for blown-up botanical images at just about the same time. In 1929, the 12-year-old twins found a snake and put it in a bucket. And of course, Cunningham uses that opportunity to photograph snake in bucket, which is such a magical image. We don't really understand the bucket visually. I imagine it's probably a metal bucket coated with white enamel, but somewhat translucent, or at least reflecting the light, but it makes this curved stage setting for the unspooling of the form of the snake. This is a motif you will not find in any other photographer of this period. Now, by 1929, she was working professionally again, largely for Mills College, doing photographs of sporting events and architecture and theater performances, and in this case, dance, which is something that would interest her throughout her life. Like photography, dance uses the body as its major means of expression. And in this image, taken in bright sunlight at the fastest possible shutter speed available to her, she is able to capture these three dancers in mid-air, highlighting their athleticism, their exuberance. Again, we get that sense of doubling or tripling, almost as if The main dancer and the two in the background are stand-ins in a way for her own three sons. And their figures merge together, and yet their shadows are each perfectly distinct. It is a brilliant photograph that captures the joie de vivre of these dancers. Now, she was still very much in touch with Edward Weston, who by this time is living in Northern California and was making his famous series of nautilus shells that he would create with very long exposures. This one, Shell, from 1927, is an obviously phallic image that Cunningham counters, perhaps, with her shells from 1932, where the twinned spiral shells look like female breasts, and the whole thing rather alludes to the myth of Venus emerging on the scallop shell. Out of the void. Both she and Weston were also photographing nudes in these years. This is the work that Cunningham calls triangles, and it is an extreme close-up of a model who was unable to be perfectly still, and therefore we get a bit of the blurring of edges that make this hark back to pictorialist style, but we get this marvelous and rather abstract composition of the triangle of the breast itself, of the space in the background where the model's right arm meets her right leg. The other triangles formed here by the pieces of arm and leg. But we also see the hair on the arm, a bit of goose flesh. And that is quite distinct from how Weston photographed the nude. So here is a very typical 1925 Weston nude that is perfect. It is alabaster-like in its texture, as if this were an ancient Greek fragment that has come to life before his camera. So we get these curves and dips and valleys that are so classic in Weston's work. Here is Cunningham a few years later making essentially the same motif, a female torso that excludes largely the head, that excludes the legs, but not as, they're not cut off as they were cropped in the Weston, but they are folded up underneath the model. But this model has a birthmark in the center of her back and some moles or freckles. Those imperfections would have disqualified her from modeling for Edward Weston. But Cunningham is interested in the particularity of her nude model. She is interested in this specific human body, whereas Weston is interested in an ideal. And Cunningham is also, in the late 1920s, still photographing male nudes. Here, dancer John Bovington, which could have been scandalous were she publishing these photographs. But again, this interest in the nude, male and female, is unusual for a female photographer. And she was photographing produce. This is her Celery from 1925. And Cunningham, as a faculty wife at Mills, she was an accomplished cook, and hers was the household that everyone gravitated to. The international students, the visiting faculty who had nowhere to go on Thanksgiving, and so forth. Her son said that nearly every night of the week, 5 or 10 people would sit down at their dinner table, not just the core family. So here she turns her camera onto the kind of thing that she'd be chopping up for soup in the evening. And we see the growth, the new leaves emerging from the cleft between the branches of celery. And a few years later, Edward Weston would make one of his most famous and celebrated images, his Pepper number 30, which, unlike his female nudes, is not a perfect pepper. You can see that it is scarred, and more, it is twisted in upon itself. It has grown funky. But it also suggests the sinuous curves of the human body. So this is a famous photograph in the history of art and photography. This one is virtually unknown. However, Weston felt so strongly about the quality of Cunningham's work that he recommended her and his son Brett Weston to be included in a major international exhibition of modernist photography held in Stuttgart in 1929. So on the left, we see the poster for that exhibition, and on the right, the catalog, which features on its cover a work by Russian constructivist artist and photographer L. Lissitzky, which is a double exposure. So we get both a portrait ahead of Lissitzky, self-portrait, and his hand at work, making a constructivist composition with compass, circles, geometrical shapes, numbers, and letters were all important parts of this particular art movement. So it's drawing on constructivism, but also on surrealism, which was the major European artistic movement between the two world wars. So the way that Lissitzky has framed his eye right in the middle of his hand is very surreal. The surrealists were deeply interested in the eye as a motif and in disembodied body parts, hands, feet, eyes, heads, and Cunningham had already been photographing hands for a number of years. In the 20s, she photographed the hands of a famous cellist. Here in 1932, it's her husband Roy Partridge's hands on the etching press, and we get his lean, ropey forearms, his strong fingers on the wheel of that press. This is a year before Man Ray made his famous series of images of Merritt Oppenheim at the etching press with a little different focus, but it's unclear whether Man Ray knew Cunningham's photograph of Partridge at his etching press. They did know each other later. She would photograph him in the 1960s. But she was also becoming interested in the double exposure, which sometimes happened accidentally. So this is a case in which the film in her camera jammed and did not advance, and therefore created a negative which included both her mother, Susan Elizabeth Cunningham, and a double-handled pitcher full of spoons. But the shape of a jug or pitcher has long been likened to the curves of the female body, and Cunningham liked the way that the back of her mother's neck and shoulders was almost identical to the curve of the jug, and also the way that the rim seemed to form a tiara. With the spoons, a kind of crown that her mother was wearing. Now, her mother was, if anything, a negative role model for Cunningham, someone who spent her energy cooking and cleaning and doing laundry for her own 5 children and the 5 children that Cunningham's widowed father had brought into the marriage. And Imogen was the oldest of the second group of 5. So she never got to pursue her own dreams or express herself creatively as Imogen would. But this is a deliberate self-portrait of the hands of makeup artist Laura LaPlante, who is drawing on an eyebrow there with rag at the ready for correction. But behind is the ghostly image of a woman all dressed in a hat and fur, someone who has already been transformed by the art of the makeup artist and through fashion, clothing, into the model of beauty. Cunningham would focus on hands here, and also in this image of Martha Graham that she made in 1931. She had the opportunity to spend the entire day with a dancer and made a number of photographs that she sent to Vanity Fair. And they liked them enough to publish some of them and to take Cunningham on as a staff photographer. And Vanity Fair was one of the most progressive publications that supported modernist photographers in the 20s and 30s. So they had her photograph the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera, who was in San Francisco in 1931 with his then unknown new wife, Frida Kahlo. And Cunningham captures this early image of a 24-year-old Kahlo, already with some of her signature strategies, Kahlos. So the rebozo that was associated with the Mexican Revolution, the chunky pre-Columbian beads around her neck, and the conquest-era Spanish silver earrings. So her armor is in place, but not completely. Her face still has this trace of vulnerability, and capturing vulnerability was something Cunningham was extremely good at. So she would photograph fellow photographer Sonia Noskowiak. Have you heard of her? Yeah? No? Probably not. But she was one of the founding members in 1932, as was Cunningham and Edward Weston and Ansel Adams of the F-64 group of photographers in Northern California. And she was, in this period, Edward Weston's lover, which meant that she was a person who was going to the supermarket to buy those peppers that would then get photographed, and then she was the person who was chopping them up and making food out of them when they were done with. And she was deeply aware that she was replaceable, that Weston would throw her over when someone younger and prettier came along, as indeed happened. So there is this intense vulnerability in this image of her fellow artist and photographer, and also fellow female in this male-dominated field. But I think she also identified with Noskowiak because of those freckles, because she could have been a member of the Cunningham crowd. She even gets vulnerability out of Cary Grant. And when Vanity Fair asked her what kind of person she would like best to photograph, she told them, "Give me the ugly men. They're not vain and they don't complain." So they gave her Cary Grant and Spencer Tracy and other Hollywood notables, but she gets Grant out onto his property in natural light against this rough, plastered brick wall that emphasizes the texture of his nubbly wool sweater, and she managed to capture a Cary Grant who is not swaggering superstar, who has this edge of vulnerability. But her ideal model would be someone like Robert B. Irwin, executive director of the American Foundation for the Blind, someone who absolutely is not vain and won't complain. So it's, whereas most portrait photography involves some collaboration between sitter and photographer. And Cunningham was always lamenting that her sitters didn't like their own faces, that they complained that she had not gotten their good side. Here, she has a sitter who is unaware of what he looks like. And therefore, she is able to make this very direct and sensitive image of him with his eyes closed. And vision is paramount to a photographer. So this is a poignant image to make. I believe it is also Irwin's hands that she captures here reading Braille, this invention that allows sight to enter via the fingertips. Here is her image of Spencer Tracy from December 1934, but that spring, Vanity Fair asked her to travel to New York and photograph Alfred Stieglitz, among others. And Roy Partridge said, "I can't go until the semester ends. Why don't you ask them if you can postpone it until the summer?" And Cunningham said, "I don't want to postpone it. I'm going to New York now." So in spring 1934, she traveled to New York, and when the semester ended, Roy traveled to Reno and secured a divorce. And not long after, remarried to a woman who would not go on photography jaunts, but would stay home and keep house and cook and clean for him. So this freed Cunningham to pursue her career on her own terms. She was still living in Oakland and still very friendly with a number of the faculty and students, like Helena Meyer, sometimes described as the greatest female fencer who ever lived, who in 1935 was on a fellowship in Los Angeles early that year, and because she was Jewish, Hitler revoked her passport and her statehood. And so she became a stateless person in California, and she went and taught German at Mills College, where Cunningham met her and made this remarkable photograph of Meyer in her fencing garb, with her mask, with her foil, bisecting her face just off Meyer's right eye, with that seriousness of purpose and sense of self that Cunningham captured in athletes and performers. But Meyer is a complicated figure because in 1936, the Nazis asked her to come to Berlin and compete for Germany. And she did, even giving a Nazi salute on the podium from her silver medal stand, which she said afterwards was solely for the safety of her relatives in the camps. So she had been manipulated into being a propaganda piece in Hitler's apparatus. But she did afterwards return to California and brought with her, as a gift to Cunningham, her first Rolleiflex, her first smaller format camera. So she began with 8x10 glass plate negatives. Then she was using more of a 4x5 negative. And starting in the 1930s, with this gift from Helena Meyer, she is using a 2¼ by 2¼ inch format negative. She continues to make images of her Mills College friends, like Shen Yao, whom she had met when she was an international student studying at Mills. Shen Yao eventually became professor of linguistics at the University of Hawaii and a close friend to the Cunningham family. In fact, around this time, she lived one summer in Imogen's household. She would make dinner for the family, and the boys would make breakfast for her. And they all learned Chinese cuisine. But she said later that these images that Cunningham made of her were the first that made her see herself as not just an intellectual, but as a beautiful human being as well. Cunningham always liked to photograph fellow artists. Here, experimenting with Kodachrome in 1940 and making this image of sculptor Mary Erkenbrack, where what pops out at us in this new color medium is the bit of lipstick and rouge that Erkenbrack has applied, although she is wearing her dirty work smock, and the bright red fake flower in her hair as she works. She would photograph Edward Weston and Ansel Adams, making portraits of these close friends of hers. Here, Weston at Point Lobos, about the time that Parkinson's disease ended Weston's photographic career. And in 1947, she moved to San Francisco and would live at 1331 Green Street for the rest of her life. And in San Francisco, she began to experiment with street photography. In other words, with making images with that smaller format camera that the subjects are unaware are being captured. Like this one she calls Discrimination at a Rummage Sale of two ladies of a certain age who are adjudicating the merchandise up for sale. It is not perhaps a kind image, although it is not as cruel as some by street photographers of this era. But she would also make this Coffee Gallery, San Francisco, in 1950. And when she exhibited it, one reviewer wrote that the photograph of a young couple drinking 7-Up together will break your heart if you have a heart to break. In 1950, this young couple was illegal. They have no future at this time that could involve marriage between the two of them. In most of the United States, that was illegal. And we see with Cunningham's use of the dark shade on the young African-American man's face and the brilliant light on the white woman's face, just some of the societal gulf that bridges them, but we also see this tenderness and longing as well. She would photograph Morris Graves that same year and was teaching at the San Francisco Art Institute at the time, and a fellow professor used this photograph in one of his seminars and asked his students, what do you make of this individual? And just based on this, with no information, they decided that Graves was someone who was soulful and poetic and deeply in touch with nature. In other words, they got him just via Cunningham's image of him. She would photograph her close friend Ruth Asawa holding one of her signature wire sculptures. And part of the beauty of Asawa's sculpture is the shadows that they cast. Here, the shadow crosses Asawa's face, this Japanese-American artist who had spent much of the Second World War in an internment camp, and yet would make these very life-affirming images. By the mid-50s, Cunningham is a grandmother and still taking out her little Rolleiflex and making family album photographs that are much more artistic than the usual such fare. So here, it's a self-portrait with her grandchildren in a funhouse mirror. Her grandson's arm seems to be 10 feet long, and she's capturing the fun, the laughter, the joy of this moment. She made this photograph of sculptor Ruth Cravath in 1955. And if it were a little bit sharper image, you could see that Cravath is wearing a brand new, crisp denim work smock over a much older, softer sweater, that she has her hair tied back with that no-nonsense bandana, that because she's a female sculptor, perhaps, her view is just a brick wall. She's not prospering enough to have a view, but she's depicted here with one of her sculptures, and she is as strong and blocky as the work that she is carving. But I think even more interesting is Cunningham's photograph of Cravath's model next to the marble he's posing for. So you can see that that head, that jawline is this little boy. That we see the roughness in the stone suggesting his hair. But what is so compelling about this photograph is, again, Cunningham's use of the medium of black and white photography to comment on race relations in the United States, how that black boy is transformed into gleaming white marble. In 1958, Cunningham was taking a seminar with her once protege, Dorothea Lange, of Migrant Mother fame. And although Cunningham was 75 years old and a very talented photographer already, she still felt she had something to learn from her younger colleague. Now, Lange told her students to make an image of something they use all the time. So Cunningham thought, well, here's something I use all the time, as she rolled out of bed, and she took some of her hairpins and tossed them onto the sheets and created this image, which is so evocative on a number of levels. Now, we do not know if Cunningham ever had another romantic relationship after the end of her marriage. If she did, she was incredibly discreet about it. But an unmade bed with hairpins from someone loosening their hair suggests a night of passion in those rumpled sheets. And the sheets themselves, with their sensual folds, are reminiscent of Baroque sculpture like Bernini. But an unmade bed has another connotation as well, that of a slovenly housewife who hasn't done her due diligence. So this is a work that resonates on multiple levels. She continued to photograph young African Americans. She loved young people. This is Stan, whom she would photograph several times throughout the years, here with light streaming through from Venetian blinds to cast that distinctive shadow pattern. And in 1959, her street photography captures herself in a shop window on Geary Street, but it's a shop that is abandoned, that has just junk, detritus in the window. We imagine that those signs say, going out of business. And it's a kind of ironic image, perhaps, of herself feeling like a relic from another era. She was still occasionally making double exposures, like this very clever The Poet and His Alter Ego of poet and filmmaker James Broughton, where she manages to capture in one doubled image, and again, the twinning within her work, she captures his good angel and his bad angel, as if they are communicating with each other, having him glance from one side to the other. And she was asked by a fellow photographer and F-64 group member, Minor White, in 1964 to contribute to an ad campaign for the brand new technology of Polaroid. And she made this image of a David Park-like California figurative painting with, in the foreground, this extremely sensual depiction of a young black man. And Minor White refused to use this image. He said he was too disturbed by the power and arrogance of the model. But Cunningham is evoking that. And she always loved to have the energy of young people around her in her studio. 1967 was the summer of love, and we can imagine that Phoenix, seen here recumbent, is a hippie still in San Francisco, has dubbed herself Phoenix, and yet in the way that her hair spills over into the foreground of the image, we can almost see the calligraphy of a Chinese depiction of a phoenix, that bird that would rise from the fire. She frequently had young photographers approaching her, asking for advice, asking if they could be her workshop assistant. And she would ask them, well, how long have you been photographing? And if they answered 4 months, she would say, yeah, come back in a decade. But she formed very important connections with a number of young photographers, including Thomas Joshua Cooper. His work was recently profiled in The New Yorker. He's become a very interesting photographer, but I suspect that what drew Cunningham to him may have been the freckles. The intensity of that gaze, but the fact that he too looks like a member of the Cunningham clan. He would re-photograph Morris Graves in his leek garden, looking like an elder sage, a Zen master. And in 1973, the year that she turned 90, she was shopping around in thrift shops and junk stores looking for mannequin parts and broken dolls and other props to use in photographs like this one, which she calls Another Hand. So this is very surrealist in its inspiration. The surrealists love dolls and mannequins, but it is an Asian American friend, a Japanese American friend, whose actual hand appears among the much paler mannequin hands. And at this point, the Vietnam War is approaching a climax. Cunningham has been wearing a peace sign around her neck for more than a decade at this point. She marched for civil rights. She marched against the Vietnam War. She, too, like her father, was on the right side of history. And when she turned 90, she got the idea of doing a series of photographs of other people living well in their 90s, which was published posthumously as After 90. So this is one of those portraits that she made for this project of radiologist Maria Kolisch, whom she was drawn to photograph, not just because of her distinguished career or because of the peace sign around her neck, but because she said Kolisch liked her face. She did not mind her wrinkles, and so she could be open and vulnerable to a photographer who would cast a spotlight on those, natural light as always, but would focus on those wrinkles, those signs of decades of wisdom and life experience. She also, in the last year of her life, made this image of a woman who was not quite 90, but was included in the project, Irene Bobby LeBerry, whose first husband had been a tattoo artist. And she said she had never disrobed for anybody that wasn't her spouse, not when she worked in a circus sideshow, never, but for Cunningham. For this 93-year-old lady, she takes off her top and poses, showing us this, this beloved body adorned by her husband as this canvas that has weathered the effects of time. And it is only in the last few years of her life that Cunningham began to achieve recognition as a photographer. In fact, she won a Guggenheim grant very late in life, but not to produce new work, rather so that she would have the funds to print her existing work. She went on Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show, and she was captured by her much younger protege, Judy Dater, in this famous image that has really become the public perception of Imogen Cunningham, Imogen and model Twinka Tebow at Yosemite, where it is as if she's repeating those subjects of her youth, Roy Partridge frolicking at Mount Rainier, Twinka frolicking at Yosemite, with this ancient, tiny, sprite-like creature with a camera around her neck, still active, still photographing in her 90s. Another work that she made for after 90 was this portrait of pianist Martha Idler. Idler had recently been diagnosed with an inoperable malignant tumor and had chosen not to seek chemotherapy to lengthen her life with all of the travails of chemotherapy of the 1970s. She said she would go when it was her time, and Cunningham agreed with that and makes this, this image of another woman who has had a brilliant and creative career in a century that did not nurture its women artists. Cunningham did not achieve recognition until late in her life, partly because, unlike her colleagues Weston or Adams, she could not photograph Half Dome again and again and again. Rather, she is very wide-ranging in her interests, doing the botanical photographs, the images of family, the pictorialist work, the street photography, but always the portraiture, because humanity is at the heart of what Cunningham was trying to depict, and she is trying to connect with people who feel positive about themselves and make that apparent in her work. But when you asked her which of her photographs was her favorite, she would say, even at the very end of her life, my favorite one is the one I'm going to make tomorrow. Thank you. Are there questions or images you'd like a second look at? Oh yes, I see a hand up. It's really... Mm-hmm. I believe that was her 4x5-inch format camera. I'm just trying to go back to that. There it is. So I believe this is her 4x5-inch format. I don't know what make of camera she was using, but it's a fairly large format film camera. What's that? Yes, it would have been sheet film. Mm-hmm. So, yes. Oh gosh, I do not know how much of her work has been lost, but that would actually be surprising because about the time she turned 90, she began to realize she was not immortal and to think about her legacy. And so she established a foundation that is now on Lopez Island that continues to curate her work. You can have, if you have a Cunningham photograph, you can have it appraised or legitimated by them, and you can have, if you're interested in purchasing a new print from one of her negatives, they are still, they are the only ones who are authorized to print from her negatives. And for a long time, it was her own son, Ron, who became a photographer who was doing the printing of her work. So I'm not certain about lost work, but certainly it existed. She lived a long time, and when she did receive a Guggenheim, which I believe was 1968 or 69. So she was in, maybe it was already even the early 70s. So she was in her 80s by the time she received a Guggenheim grant. And it was, she'd been denied a Guggenheim earlier for making photographs. This one was for printing previous work where she had negatives. She had decades of negatives, some of which she had never had the opportunity to print and to see, her work spread out before her. So in such a long career, it's almost certain that some was lost, but it wouldn't have been from her own home that things were tossed out, because in that situation, I'm sure, her executors, her sons, I think, were at first the trustees of the Imogen Cunningham Trust, and they wouldn't have thrown anything out. So yes. Mm-hmm. Enlargements? Oh. Yes, you can still buy them, inkjet prints. Yes, so her son, Rondal, very much against the wishes of her ex-husband, became a photographer, and he was the one who, until the end of his life, was a master printer for the Cunningham estate. And apparently learned how to do inkjet printing and make really beautiful inkjet enlargements of her work. So taking that technology into the 21st century. So yes, in the front first. Did she do pretty well financially? I think she lived very frugally, and I think she did well enough to have a comfortable lifestyle, to own her own home, but she was never wealthy, not like, say, Ansel Adams. So she wasn't starving. She wasn't scrambling. She had enough to be comfortable, but she was kind of a minimalist. She wasn't interested in clothes or fashion or cars. In fact, I can't remember she ever learned to drive. I kind of think she didn't, but I'm not positive. I know Edward Weston never learned to drive, and so Sonia Noskowiak was also his chauffeur, but I'm not positive about Imogen. So, but you don't need a car in San Francisco. So yes. No, I don't know anything about the photographs she took on Vashon around 1912. So that would have been this era. It might be easy. Well, I'm not too far along. So it would have been around this era. It's possible that that's taken on Vashon, but it's hard to say specifically what the location would have been. But she certainly knew the Puget Sound area very well, and did photograph in a number of locations. But that specific detail I am not aware of. Other questions, or did everyone want to know about her work on Vashon? Yes. Yes. So eyes, nose, mouth. That bright stripe would be nose. But it's a testament to a sculptor's or a painter's or a photographer's skill for us to be able to see the features beneath the veil. Well, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving and enjoy the Cunningham show. 200 of her photographs will be on view at SAM starting this week. So, thank you.